Singapore is going through a rather uncertain time due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The government has announced that they will set aside almost $55 billion to deal with the outbreak and its aftermath. Now, out of this $55 billion, which is around 11% of Singapore's GDP, $48.4 billion was announced during the supplementary budget speech last Thursday, the 26th of March. Despite the gloomy outlook, the Singapore government remains optimistic and is encouraging businesses to take this chance to digitalize themselves and allow their workers to upgrade their skills. Well, according to Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat, the government is enhancing programs for digitalization and skills upgrading so that businesses can make use of this downtime. This includes an enhancement to the SME's Go Digital program, which provides support for digital solutions, including basic remote working tools. Mr. Heng also adds that the government will also raise the maximum support levels for the Productivity Solutions Grant to 80% and the Enterprise Development Grant to 90% to spur this transformation. All these enhancements will last until December this year. However, in a recent survey by QBE Insurance Singapore finds that small and medium-sized enterprises in Singapore are apprehensive about digitalization, and this is somewhat causing them to fall behind in terms of preparedness to the future digital economy. Would these new initiatives from the government encourage more businesses here to digitalize themselves, and how can businesses avoid the challenges faced when digitalizing their companies? In the studio this morning is Minister for Communications and Information and Minister in charge of Trade Relations, Mr. S. Iswaran. Minister, thank you so much for taking the time, and good morning to you.
Very good morning to all of you.
Let's start off with the acceleration of digitalization. So we've got this COVID-19 pandemic, pretty much caused life to come to a bit of a standstill. Countries all over the world. Singapore has implemented very targeted measures. Okay, you've got travel restrictions, social distancing efforts. Nightlife outlets have come to a bit of a standstill for a month. In terms of these implementations, it's not a total shutdown, but what needs to happen? If there's any chance, what should we look out for in terms of how this targeted shutdown gets accelerated?
Well, I will put it this way. First of all, I think we should think of COVID-19 as basically a battle that we are fighting against this virus and its spread. And that battle is taking place on three fronts. One is on the medical front, and how do we save lives? The second is on the economic front, and how do we save jobs and stabilize our businesses? And the third is on the social front. How do we ensure that we remain resilient as a society and at the same time also work, because this response requires the full cooperation of all our people through these various measures that we're putting in place. In terms of measures and, how far do we need to go and what extreme measures are required, are they necessary at all? If you look at the way we have responded so far, it has been calibrated in response to the situation as it evolves. And we have been informed by both the data that in terms of the epidemic in Singapore's context, our scientific knowledge of the virus, and also what we have seen in other countries and learned from their experience. It's a very dynamic situation, and that is why you see that our response has also been a very dynamic one. Mm-hmm. We're trying to, it's not about a 0-1 solution, it is about taking measures and calibrating. Having said that, as we have said from the government, if there is a need to take more measures, we will do so. Our Prime Minister has said this and so on. At the same time, however, we want to make sure that where possible, we are calibrating and responding. So whether it's travel restrictions or social distancing measures and so on.
All right, Minister, I was actually discussing with the team, right, whether I should call this interview around how we are fighting COVID-19 in a digital way, the digital fight against COVID-19. So this actually is on a couple of fronts. You've got, encouraging companies to become more digital in how they work and socialize. You've got the fight against fake news and misinformation over social media. We'll get into that in just a bit. But what I want to get your thoughts on is how we are using technology to track in terms of tracing, contact tracing. You have this new app, the Trace Together app. How has been the take-up so far? Have there been any concerns about privacy, about people pretty much being tracked day to day?
Well, I think the Trace Together app is a new app. I think the take-up rate is about 900,000 or so. But as PM himself mentioned in a recent interview, we still have work to do because I think it is a new application. And at the same time, I think, it's work done between GovTech and the Ministry of Health. And there are significant safeguards in place to protect the privacy. So it's not so much about the where you are and so on. It is more about the whom you are interacting with if there's a need to do contact tracing. But this is a work in progress, like many other solutions. But there's a larger point that you're making, which is digitalization and how does this situation help us? So I saw a meme recently, necessity is the mother of invention. And the meme said, who has helped you most in terms of digitalization? Your CEO, your CTO, or COVID-19? And then they circle COVID-19.
I've seen that too.
And that's precisely the point, you see, because I think no matter how much we have made the case again and again, and we've had significant take-up rates, I think right now businesses see the value proposition because whether it is working remotely, whether it is transacting with business partners around the world, and also for employees understanding why digital technologies are very relevant and useful. I think on all those fronts, what you see is people have now come on board in a more decisive way.
This is actually helping the push to become a smart nation, adding more urgency. And I'm just wondering if you can also share your thoughts on the level of public trust in digital services right now. Has that changed with what's happening?
I think certainly there's a lot greater awareness. Trust has generally been there, but I think in a situation like this, it is, in a sense, an opportunity to reinforce both the value but also the potential of such technologies. So I'll give you one example. We have used the gov.sg WhatsApp service, something that we initiated in the early stages of this crisis. And today, we are pushing out more than 1 million messages a day in the 4 languages. And that is really a significant milestone, considering that, where we started was a small fraction of that. Yeah. And the key thing here is it's because people trust this information source. So in other words, it helps them get reliable information in a timely manner. And it also enables them then to navigate all the other information that they're receiving on a daily basis. So we think that these and many other sort of digital sources of information and ways of communicating with our broader population, key part of not just battling the crisis, but also in terms of preparing ourselves for the next phase of digital evolution in Singapore's economy.
But, looking between the lines there's always this underlying worry about fake news. And we've seen that play out throughout this entire COVID-19 crisis, Minister. But in terms of this whole exercise, this whole movement to stay healthy, go digital, I'm curious. We can see the government's efforts where businesses are concerned, individuals are concerned. But what about the seniors? How do you continue to encourage this age group to upgrade and embrace digitalization?
I think this is always going to be an important part of our broader effort on digitalization. So we have a range of programs. IMDA has been running this for some time now, working together with partners, corporate partners, community partners, bringing digital skills, digital knowledge to our older citizens who may not be as tech savvy as others, although I don't think it's actually an age factor as much as an attitude factor in this regard. So I think whether you're talking about workers and their skills and how we can develop them, we have a range of programs. Whether it's for companies, so we have the Start Digital, Go Digital, Grow Digital. All of these serve, for startups, for businesses that are scaling up, and for businesses going overseas, creating digital solutions. And for our larger, broader population, not just understanding and acquiring digital skills, but also understanding cybersecurity and its implications. This has been part of a broader effort in terms of raising digital capacity in our society.
I missed that moving from the individual to the business side, right? There's been huge efforts to encourage businesses to become more digital. What has been the, challenge or obstacle holding back some of these businesses to do so? And if you look at some of the sectors, some of them have been saying, we can't go digital, especially the construction sides, the retail services side. There are some obstacles in the way. What do you tell these businesses in the midst of this huge push to become more digital?
Well, there's a few myths about this that we need to address. The first is that digital only applies to some sectors. That's not true. Digitalization cuts across every sector. So whether you're in a very traditional business, and we have got businesses that are in Kampong Glam and Little India doing very traditional stuff, who are also able to use it, whether it's for digital payment solutions, whether it is for the way they interact with their logistic service providers, etc., and so on. There's a whole range of solutions. The second point I would make is people always argue, this is not a good time for digitalization, because when times are good, I'm very busy and it's very hard. When times are bad, I can't spare the resources.
Sure.
So actually what you really need is first a clear decision by the organization, by its leaders, to say, this is an important strategic decision. We need to do this in order to be better positioned for the future. Once that decision is made, then they can go into planning and executing strategies. And it can be a very layered strategy. And that is also why much of the support provided by IMDA through various programs are designed in that way. So, for example, for SMEs, some of the most immediate popular things that they want on the digital front is digital payment solutions. They also want to have online marketing capability. Then from there, you go into things like supply chain management and general ERP enterprise solutions and things like that. So there's a range of these things that can be done progressively. And you could argue a similar approach for workers as well. It's not like you have to just jump into the deep end in one fell swoop. What you can do is work on it, and in terms of taking incremental steps, but having a overall strategy that takes you to the end point in terms of the kind of capabilities you need.
Well, if the legal sector could do it, they struggled for a while, so can we. Minister, very quickly before we get into traffic, 5G, with all this happening, especially with COVID-19, people having to set up the infrastructure to work from home, is there a chance 5G gets delayed in Singapore, or does it have to come faster than ever?
Well, actually, an experience like this emphasizes the importance of digital infrastructure being up to mark.
Okay.
Today, we have good tech infrastructure that has enabled us to do a lot of the things that we are doing, but we are already thinking about the next bound. That's why 5G. And our commitment remains the same. We want a world-class, resilient and secure 5G infrastructure for Singapore. It's going to be the backbone of our digital economy, and we are on track to get that implemented in Singapore.
Money FM 89.3. Good morning. It is the Breakfast Huddle. Elliott Danker and Ryan Huang with a post-budget 2020 conversation. Our guest this morning is Minister for Communications and Information and Minister in charge of Trade Relations, Mr. S. Iswaran. And I've already given him a preview of our election question. He hopes I was kept offside. I just want to point out this morning that we're all observing social distancing. We're at least 3 feet 3 inches. That makes up a meter apart. So that's good. Fake news, Minister, there was a fake news law that came into effect as of October 2nd last year. It's called Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, POFMA for short. And we've seen how during this COVID-19 crisis that POFMA really came into effect. At that time, a lot of people talked about how it could potentially be a hindrance to free speech. Now that COVID-19 has come around, POFMA in effect, would you say it's actually very effective?
I think the COVID-19 experience has, in many ways, vindicated what we've been saying all along when we introduced the legislation, and in particular. The key point is this. Today, we are in a digital world. People are getting information through a variety of digital sources, and information, especially that comes through digital sources, can be very viral. And sometimes fake information can cause very adverse consequences, and then we have to spend a great deal of time and effort recovering from this. So some of the measures that we have in place, and you've seen this in other countries in recent times, they're very blunt instruments. For example, they've gone around, they've arrested people who have purveyed fake news. They have, in some cases, blocked entire sites or even disconnected from the internet in some cases. And we've seen all of these experiences. Our legislation is fit for purpose because what it allows us to do is to take a very targeted approach in response to fake news. So in particular, what we seek to do, and this has been time and again what we have demonstrated, is to juxtapose the truth with the fake news. So the eyeballs are there and people will then see what was the original post, and they can also access the truth, and they can then decide for themselves. And we think that is a very appropriate way to deal with this challenge. And it has actually proven to be very effective in the course of COVID-19. Although it is very, very unfortunate that people still persist in purveying falsehoods, even in these very trying times, and it causes, fear and panic in our population. So we have to move swiftly and decisively to deal with such fake news or falsehoods, and that's where the POFMA legislation has been very valuable.
Yeah, on that point, Minister, we've been talking about how this is also a digital fight against COVID-19 in terms of fake news, misinformation. In fact, last week we've been hearing some rumors about how we might go into DORSCON red. And the other rumor I've been quite affected about is how schools might close, because I've got a kid in school and that really affects me in terms of daycare. So I'm just wondering if you give us an idea how much of a spike there has been in terms of misinformation being spread and how Singapore could potentially better manage what's been going around in the social media circles.
Well, I hope you've subscribed to our gov.sg WhatsApp. So you will know that we put out the information very quickly to say we are not going to DORSCON red. We are not doing school closures, because we have to respond. And the fact that we have this reach of nearly 1 million subscribers and sending out more than 1 million messages because it's in 4 languages helps us a great deal. And I think the key point in all of this is really ensuring that people have timely information, and that's one of the focal points in our effort. And your particular question was on
schools being closed. Do you have a team tracking all the fake news around social media to react to it?
Well, I think fake news and the incidence of fake news, I think there's been a salutary effect. The fact that early in this experience, we moved very decisively on a few instances, MRT station closing down, etc., etc. And I think as a result, it has in general had a salutary effect. So, even in private messaging services, where sometimes such news is very quick to circulate, what I find now is the instinct is for people to ask the question, is this fake? Is this real? Which I think is a very good instinct, because what it means is people realize that they need to question the source, the authenticity of the information and its reliability. And you always have the access to official sources, whether it's MOH's website, gov.sg website, and also our WhatsApp service. So you can then satisfy yourself that this is in fact the truth, authentic information, before you share it with your loved ones and your friends.
Yeah, or you can check the Straits Times or listen to Money FM. Minister.
Absolutely. I think the media plays a very important role, you guys and the entire team in the media industry, because it's key. Yeah. Because the mass media remains mainstream media remains one of the key sources of information that people rely on.
The other thing that we've been noticing is back when we went to DORSCON Orange nearly 2 months ago, there was a spate of panic buying among Singaporeans. And of course, what also compounded that issue was Malaysia closing its borders. So there is this huge concern around food security. How do you, as Minister of Trade Relations, help to, address these concerns, especially when we look at the facts? Singapore has topped the Food Security Index, which is something published by EIU for 2 years in a row, but we still get panic buying.
Indeed. So I think the fear is understandable, people's reaction. We need to be able to put the message across and reassure them. And I think ultimately the test is in their experience. And every time there's been some kind of panic surge, people can then see that actually the supplies are there and it comes back. So I think that's the ultimate proof. But 2 things I would highlight. One, we have stockpiles for essential items, and this is something that the Ministry of Trade and Industry has put out time and again. And I think this is an important point for people to register. And second, and this has been a key part of our strategy for food security, and in general, even things like energy security and so on, is diversification of sources. So we are not wholly reliant on one source or only 1 or 2 sources, which then makes us more vulnerable to supply chain disruptions from those sources. By diversifying, we're able to get our supplies, in this case food, from different places. And this remains an important part of strategy. And in fact, you can see that in our supermarkets today, that any one item that you think about, actually we get our supplies from quite far-flung places of the world sometimes as part of the overall service to the market.
Minister for Communications and Information and Minister in charge of Trade Relations, Mr. S. Iswaran, in the studio with us. Just 2 more questions, sir. And here it comes, general election question, but not quite what you expect. I'm curious, with what we've learned from COVID-19, What comes into play in terms of news management heading into the elections?
I think information and news management, whether you're in a situation like COVID-19 or in normal circumstances and or when you're going into a general election period, I think the emphasis on, most importantly, ensuring people are getting reliable, truthful information.
Sure.
And I think the experience in other countries has shown that, in particular, in the hustings period, that's when there's a more froth, especially in social media in the digital realm, and a lot more misinformation starts to spread. So the key is ensuring that people, our citizens, are well informed, they understand the facts clearly, and we're able to debunk the falsehoods quickly, so that then when they exercise their vote, they do so fully informed, and then they can exercise their judgment.
There's also a lot of onus on the individual. It still comes back down to that.
Absolutely. I think that's key, and that has always been our emphasis, that ultimately our front line are our people who are actually engaged in the digital realm, getting information, interacting. So as far as possible, education, awareness, and the understanding of how information can sometimes be misused is important in order for us to be active and productive netizens.
It's impossible to predict when COVID-19 will end. Some people say June, some people say end of the year. Officials have said end of the year. But our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, in an interview with CNN just 2 days ago, said, it could even take several years for the virus to go around the world, run its course, unless, of course, something happens to abort it, maybe a vaccine or something. Sir, does this change the 1 year or 5 year events forecast? And in particular, August 9th, National Day, is coming very soon. By July, you start to have rehearsals, social distancing. How does that come into play looking ahead? Is this something, the government is looking at?
Well, we are living in extraordinary times, and they call for extraordinary responses. You've seen that, for example, in the budget. And the draw that our finance minister has announced on our reserves. This is quite unprecedented, the scale of the budget. You've seen that in the kind of social distancing measures that we've put in place, or the safe distancing measures as they call them. And you've also seen it in the medical response and the frontline response that we have mounted nationwide. I think all of these speak to the fact that ultimately we should be prepared for different types of contingencies. National Day, August 9, we will celebrate. How we celebrate, I think, will be a function of the environment we are in at that time. And I think we should keep ourselves open, nimble to different possibilities. But what might change is the way we celebrate, but the spirit and the sense of nationhood, I think that should remain undiminished.
It's very different, right? Because you have your first National Day, the parade that's in the rain. I'll never forget that, and stories of that. And this time around, we're probably going to have our first safe distancing National Day. Who knows?
Quite possibly, but I think if you remember that first National Day parade, where it was in the rain in the early days, I think, again, there have been rain, but it didn't dampen the spirit of a young nation. And we are still a young nation, and I think whatever the challenge, the key is rallying together, and National Day is an important point at which we can come together as Singaporeans and look to the future.
We've been speaking with Minister for Communications and Information and Minister in charge of Trade Relations, Mr. S. Iswaran. So thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.